welcome to our Chapter 8 lecture. This is entirely about broadcast. Um, Broadcast journalism changed all previous forms of mass media, newspapers, magazines, and film. It allowed voices and images to travel through the airways into people's homes. It meant that events could now be reported on live. You didn't have to read about them the next day. And then radio eventually became portable and laid the groundwork for mobile journalism. The airwaves that are used for broadcast are now used for our wireless technology. And it's interesting that some of the laws that were made back in the 1930s regarding radio are still being used by mass media companies today. The common thing between print and broadcast is that they require research and they require a script. For audio journalism, it's basically reporting news and information with sound. Radio, when it came out, was dominant, and then it had to specialize in order to compete with television. However, podcasts are now emerging as powerful platforms of audio journalism, as we have seen. What are the elements of audio journalism? You have sequence, the sequence of events, the way you're going to tell the story, the tone. The tone is very important in which you tell the story, and then the ambiance, the setting that you can create. And you can do this with description, or you can do it with what we call ambient sound, which we'll get into in a little bit. Writing to be heard. There's 4 C's here. Correctness, which as we know is important in all forms of journalism. Then you have clarity. Each word has to be the right word. It has to be as clear and simple as possible. Conciseness, you want to condense it. One of the main differences between broadcast and print is that you have very limited time to tell a story. So you're going to be basically writing stories in audio and video format for about 30 seconds of time here. So you need to be incredibly concise here. And color, you know what I mean? You have to bring life to it. And one of the ways that you do that is to put it into a very conversational tone. And one of the ways you put it into a conversational tone is to use the present tense instead of the past tense. So that's one of the biggest differences, that when you're writing in print, you're using the past tense. When you're writing in audio or video, you're usually using the present tense to give it kind of that conversational tone, that sense of immediacy. So some techniques and conventions here, right? When we quote somebody, when we attribute in print, we know that the attribution goes after the quote. In audio or video, it goes before the quote, right? Titles come before names, and then you say, according to Mayor James Kenney, and then you have your clip or your quote. The other thing that is different in audio and video broadcasts is you actually don't want to use quotes very much. You don't want to say, Mayor Jim Kenney said, quote. You either want to paraphrase it, or you want to use the audio clip, and we'll get into how to do those audio clips in a little bit. Avoid abbreviations. You don't use AP style abbreviations for audio or visual because you actually want to make the announcer, you're usually writing a script for an announcer or an anchor person, and you want it to make their job as easy as possible. So you're not going to abbreviate things, you're going to write them all out. So avoid direct quotes. Attribution goes after. Use as little punctuation as necessary because you don't want the announcer to have to kind of figure out what the punctuation means. We use different forms. We use slashes for pauses, which we'll get into in a minute. You want to round off numbers and statistics, right? If you want to say the budget, the Philadelphia school budget was, was $1,700,000, blah, 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 blah. You just want to say it was around $1 billion, right? You want to round it off so that announcer doesn't have to read every single number. You want to personalize the news. We talked about that conversational tone. It means you can use second person. You might be scared of, the new mosquito that has arrived in the U.S., something like that, right? You want to avoid symbols, right? You want to avoid like the dollar sign. You're just going to write out $1 million, right? You want to use visual clues, that slash. So when you're writing a script, 1 slash for a pause, 2 slash marks for the end of a sentence, 3 for the end of a paragraph. And we also want to use phonetic spelling for hard to pronounce words. You don't want to have your announcer trying to figure out how to pronounce something, right? So what we do is we write out the person's name, but then in parentheses, we put out what that sounds like. So for example, Matisse Thybulle, right? You would put in parentheses, Matisse Thybulle. So it kind of slows it down and allows the announcer to know how that person's name should be pronounced. You want to avoid third-person pronouns a lot in audio because a lot of times the listener or viewer is not going to know who they represent. And then you want to avoid what are called oppositional phrases, words that rename nouns. So, for example, you don't want to say Jane Smith, the mayor of Philadelphia. You want to say Philadelphia Mayor Jane Smith, right? So you want to be as direct as possible. Use present tense and then avoid starting sentences with those dependent clauses like which, words that start with which or something like that. You want to start with subject, verb, right? And complete sentences instead of starting those scripts with dependent clauses. Story structure, again, this is really different. A lot of you already pointed this out in your discussions. The audio and video stories use dramatic unity. They don't use inverted pyramid. Three parts. The climax, which you're going to start off with in your lead, the cause, and then the effect. We think of audio and visual stories as completed circles instead of that inverted pyramid. The stories are shorter, therefore you have to grab the attention of the listener or viewer as soon as possible. Every word is important. That's kind of like why we start off with the climax of the story. Another difference is that stories are measured in time, not words or column inches. So a newspaper editor might say, or a web editor might say, I need 600 words on this topic. A radio show producer is going to say, I need 30 seconds on this story, right? So it's up to us to kind of figure out how many words equals 30 seconds and kind of time it all out. So when we write the audio or video news story, they have a beginning, a middle, and an end, which is different than that inverted pyramid. We want to keep the writing as simple as possible. Now there's different types of broadcast stories. One is called a voicer, where it's only the reporter's or anchor's voice. And maybe you want to turn on like Channel 6 Action News and kind of see which ones of these you can identify. So a voicer, only the reporter or anchor's voice. A soundbite or actuality is an actual quote or maybe even construction noise if you're doing something about gentrification, right? The soundbite is written in a script like this. You introduce who's speaking. The mayor announced a new curfew across the city after the mass shooting on South Street. Roll tape, all residents under, end tape, in order to keep all residents safe. 15. The 15 stands for how many seconds that quote from the mayor is going to be. So we don't have quotation marks. We have roll tape, end tape. What this means is that the producer is going to insert that quote when the announcer says that line. The mayor announced a new curfew across the city after the mass shooting on South Street. The announcer now knows that the producer is going to put in that quote. That quote's going to be read by the mayor, and then they can go around to the next part of the story. So that's also called a wraparound, right? When you have information, then you have a soundbite or actuality, because the information wraps around the soundbite, right? Okay. Recording and editing audio, almost all of our phones have microphones now, so you can record your interviews. You can record press conferences, both with audio and video material. You can record that ambient noise. For example, if you're going to a Sixers game, you might want to, record some of the chants, right, for Tyrese Maxey, etc. We can also use, and then when we edit our broadcasts, we can use free software like Audacity is a good one to edit. Now there are ethics when we're recording and editing. A lot of the time, almost all the time, unless you're going undercover, which is almost all never ethical, you want to make sure the sources are being recorded, right? So what you want to do is, before starting an interview or before trying to get a quote from somebody, you want to say, my name is so-and-so, I work for the Philadelphia Tribune, I'm doing a story on this, and then say, do you mind if I record you? Most people, I would say 85% of the people almost always say yes, right? Um, when you use those quotes in audio and video, you don't want to edit out words and you don't want to take the quotes out of context. You also don't want to coach sources or lead them, and you don't want to interrupt them. If their quote's going on for too long and you're only going to if they keep going and going and going, just let them go. Get that material, and then you can edit out some of those sentences later on. So, for television news, video news was once controlled by large news conglomerates, many of which got their start in radio, CBS, NBC, ABC. They're still very popular. Of course, they changed when cable came along. But they are the three dominant broadcast. And there's a difference between broadcast and cable. When we say broadcast, we mean it travels through the air. When we say cable obviously goes through wires, right? And then there are different laws for broadcast television. For example, you can't curse, whereas you can on cable. But we'll get into all that when we go into the law and ethics chapter. Okay, and the cable really changed the television news game because it offered 24-hour content. But even before the internet, broadcast and cable had news producers who were agenda setters. They told the world what to think about. News was expensive to produce and required a network to find an audience. Those producers and editors controlled content. Many different groups were not included in a lot of that news production. So the web has changed that, right? We have the tools to create our own news broadcasts. We can also become citizen journalists, as we've seen with a lot of the police murders that have happened over the last several years. That footage collected by citizen journalists, right? And we can release that content through social media platforms. So while many of us might dream of working for some of those big networks or big cable companies, right? We have the tools to produce our own news broadcasts and to get news out to audience right now. It has changed, right? Social media and what you would say low cost of entry, because if our phone can create a news broadcast, it's changed who sets the agenda. We have more power now, right? And the audience has more power to kind of demand, because there are so many more options out there, demand more fair reporting on stories that have traditionally been swept under the rug, and we've seen the effects of that over the last decade, right? So the selection of broadcast news, producers look for stories that have audio and visual content. Sometimes they are criticized for doing this, where they prioritize what kind of video or audio clip they can get instead of the actual real news content, right? You're not going to see a lot of stories about health insurance on the nightly news, because what are you going to show? For audio and video content, right? However, people really need to know about health insurance regulations, etc. Timeliness, really important. Breaking or recent news, most up-to-the-date information is what broadcast news is looking for. Also, information, not explanation, just the amount of information the audience needs to know. It can be a short, informative segment. Telling the story with video. Video stories should be able to be described in a single sentence, right? It's almost like a pitch, right? It needs to be described. Yesterday the mayor signed an order. Um, Yesterday the mayor signed an order requiring all teens to be under curfew and home by 11 o'clock. The number one rule for video: keep it simple, right? It has to be simple because you have to kind of shoot video. It has to match your script and it needs to be as simple as possible, right? Now, video stories still use the journalist's questions: who, what, where, and when. And then once you have all the answers to those questions, begin to visualize what the story will look like and what kind of video content you'll need. You want to take video of interviews, places, events, whatever you need to tell the story. Then you're going to start writing the script based on the visual material that you have, right? When you take video, let the camera be the storyteller, right? You want to plan and think about what kind of stuff you need, and it's better to have too much video than too little. There's nothing worse than getting back to the newsroom and realizing you missed a shot or you don't have something to plug in here based on this, so try to take as much video as possible. I understand that it is difficult to edit the more video you have, but it's better to have too much than too little. When you're taking video, you want to fill the frame of the camera. You don't want too much background or margin. One of the ways to kind of figure this out is the rule of thirds, and we'll go over this in chapter 9, where we talk about images and writing. The rule of thirds: you're basically using 3 lines to divide the screen, the viewfinder, and and then using that to determine kind of like what goes where, what to focus on, right? Headroom: you want to make sure, if you're doing a shot, you're interviewing somebody, you want to make sure that there's some space between the top of the head and the frame, and it should be free of objects. Like, for example, right now, if you look at me, it looks like I have some kind of pipe coming out of my head. You want to make sure that there is nothing in that headroom, right? Because it can look very distracting. If you don't have a tripod, hold the camera with elbows at ribs and try to make it as still as possible. We want to use different angles, different shots, right? Close-ups, medium range, long range, different angles, right? I once would report on a DA, DA Linton Abraham, who would refuse to be shot from the bottom right angle because she thought that it made her face look a certain kind of way. But, anyway, we want different angles, different people, and one of the things that can differentiate you is if you see a different angle, right? If you see a different shot, right, that nobody else is going to have. Maybe it's, more aesthetic. Maybe it shows something, the reaction of a person in the crowd. Try to be creative out there when you're getting video. Some editing suggestions: create storyboards, right? Storyboards are basically an outline where you just kind of do little stick figure drawings, or maybe you're a better artist than I am, and you kind of like draw the scene about how you want it to go. You always want to avoid repetition, simplify transitions. We all know that video editing software has these crazy transitions that you can use. You just want them to be as smooth as possible, right? You kind of want to like use cutaways where you're going from one person maybe to the scene. You want to get establishing full shots, which is a full picture of the event. Then pay attention to pacing. Make sure the shots aren't too short or too long. right? Like a really short shot next to a really long shot can be really distracting. And then you want to finally, check the sound quality. When you're writing broadcast copy, once you have your video, you're going to start writing the copy. The copy is usually prepared for an announcer. You want to try to make their job easy as possible. For example, I